Welcome to Free the Mind, Free the People, a podcast where we come together to empower each other through knowledge and discuss the issues that shape our everyday lives. All opinions and information shared in this podcast are held by the host alone and do not represent the stances of the University of Central Florida and the Department of Sociology.
Hi everyone, this is Marina.
And I'm Hallie.
And today, this is a bonus episode that we have. And as you may have seen in our previous bonus episode, which is titled Marina's Story, go listen to that if you haven't. I discussed my journey moving from Puerto Rico to the US. However, I did acknowledge that I am not an expert in terms of politics or like the relationship between Puerto Rico and the US. So we wanted to bring in an expert who can speak more to the history of Puerto Rico and the issues that Puerto Ricans continue to face today. So before introducing our guest, I do want to point out the title of this episode and contextualize it a little bit more. So the title is La Isla del Colonialismo, a closer look at Puerto Rico with Dr. Fernando Rivera. I guess I just introduced him. Okay, so basically, for those who may not know, Puerto Rico has a nickname, and that is La Isla del Encanto, which means the island of charm or enchantment, if you translate it. And so in the previous episode, I discussed how I personally viewed Puerto Rico as a colony of the US to this day. And this is debated. And so I wanted to explore this topic in this conversation. And so that is why colonialismo means colonialism. So I want to explore and answer that question throughout this episode. So now we can introduce our guest.
Thank you for all the context to that. And with that in mind, we'd like to formally introduce today's guest, Dr. Fernando Rivera from the UCF Department of Sociology. So thank you for coming on today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course, we're very excited to have you on. And so just to get started, we'd like to know, just introduce yourself to our audience to get some background. Where were you born? And what is your educational background? And how did you get into your interests in sociology?
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. And in my junior year, I went to the University of Puerto Rico, Maya West. So it's the engineering school, and I was a social scientist in the engineering school. But in my junior year, I participated in one of those National Science Foundation undergrad research experiences, and it happened to be in Lincoln, Nebraska. So that was my first incursion into grad school, where I did my master's and I did my PhD at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, which I still, I visit Lincoln often, so I'm still connected to the department and the university. And then after that, I did a postdoc at Rutgers in the Institute for Healthcare Policy and Aging Research. And after that, I came to UCF, and I've been here since 2005.
Wow. Quite the journey.
Absolutely.
And quite the welcome to the US, to Nebraska.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's, different experiences are always good in terms of that. As in a sense of why I chose sociology, I think growing up you see a lot of those inequalities and you want to understand them a little bit more, and I think I'm a big fan of this issue of kind of like your biography and trying to understand the world. I don't think that I'm that special, that what happens to me only happens to me, and I want to know I'm pretty sure that this happens to a lot of people, and try to understand sort of those mechanisms of what actually happens within society, right? Because if you think about it, we create sort of those conditions, right? And sort of understanding what happens, how we treat each other, and obviously humans are very complicated, and it's fascinating, right?
Yes.
And it seems every time period that we're going through and the things that we're going through right now, more and more we need more social scientists and sociologists to really try to understand and kind of like bring that contextual aspect of it that sometimes is missing. But I think we suffer from a very hyper individualism type of mentality, and we have to tie the dots. And I think that's what sociology offers, right? That we're not alone in the universe, but everything that you do somehow impacts other aspects of your life, And, we don't live in a vacuum. And I think that's what sociology brings about.
Right, that's extremely important. And Marina and I often talk about the idea of context and the sociological imagination, how what happens to one individual is part of a larger system that we can all look at. So it's really important to look past the individual. And I think sociology in general agrees with that, which is why I find the field so interesting.
Yeah, and I had a follow-up question there. So would you say, so given your experiences and you've been able to connect your experiences to the broader system as we do in sociology. So I'm wondering, like, so your experience in Puerto Rico, the life that you had there, how did that impact your perception of the world? And especially given that you had to transition later on to the United States?
Growing up in an island, right? Not to be sarcastic, but you're surrounded by water. So you have sort of kind of like that unique experience, right? Mm-hmm. And when you're in Puerto Rico, you think that San Juan is the center of the universe, is the place to go and all those type of things. So you don't have kind of like that global type of perspective that I think sometimes people underlook when you're in the continental United States. Think about all the interactions that you can have with people from all over the world. And I think in some of the things, when you don't have a context of reference, everything starts to be normalized in a way that perhaps is not healthy, right? Yeah. You look at the statistics, right? So when I went to college, it was probably the highest number of murders in Puerto Rico at that time. Did I have fear of crime going out or anything like that? No. Running from parties where there were shootings and people were getting beat up, it was a normal thing. But we know that that's not normal. Right. But you kind of like following this trajectory in terms of that without that context of reference that you might have that, we don't have to do this, right? And, and then you start analyzing everyday life in terms of, the facilities, the roads, the lines at the supermarket, customer service, all those type of things, right? Obviously, you miss your culture and your friends and, that warmth of the island and all those type of things. But that opened up, sort of the experience of, all right, this perhaps we can do something different. And we don't have to just settle for this and call it normal and continue to do so. So I think that's a lot of experiences that people have, right? And I'm not talking, kind of like the 1 week trip you take to Disney from Puerto Rico and imagine that that's the reality. But for a lot of people, sadly, they think that's sort of the reality of coming here. But, right. You did share a lot of the things that you have to go through as well. And especially, in a tough age when you're a teenager, kind of like doing that transition, I was old enough, I had my university years and all sort of stuff. So I was kind of like more in the professional stage of it. But, it opened a lot of different perspectives, right? In terms of, and I saw it, right? A lot of people were leaving, my professors at my university were leaving, so I started to see the exodus out here and trying to analyze what was going on out here. And, we'll get into those topics a little bit further right. in the podcast. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. And I mean, and just to go off of that, like that I experienced that realizing that so the things that I was noticing over there as a young child, I knew those weren't normal when I got here, but then I also noticed the things that were happening here that to me were not normal, but to people here they were, or I guess, normative. To them it was like, oh yeah, no, this is just how we do things. This is just, it's not an issue. But to me, that outsider perspective also ended up causing a lot of the, I guess, conflict and confusion for me.
No, absolutely, because there's a process of integration, right? And, because, from the news and the discussion in Puerto Rico about the status, you think that they're talking about Puerto Rican statehood or the status of Puerto Rico all the time in Congress. And you come here and say, Puerto Rico, what, where, what?
Yeah, exactly.
People don't even know, right? I have had, so what part of Mexico Puerto Rico is from? Are you a U.S. citizen? All those type of things. And, depending on your perspective, you think yourself. So I think that's kind of like a clash that happens because you have kind of like these expectations, right? And, I always
Yeah.
joke in terms of even on language, right? You think that you know English, and I don't know, Marina, kind of like some of the songs in Puerto Rico say, pollito, chicken, gallina, hen, la
Yes.
pencil, pluma, pen. And we think we know we're bilingual, right? We
Yeah.
got that knowledge and we understand that it's not, right? And, even everyday language, I remember, the difference between a shower and a bath, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of like those things out there that, sometimes, the colloquial everyday type of language also takes time to understand as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So we already had like a whole podcast just there, but so now, so you've spoken a little bit about, your career, how you got to UCF. And so we do know that there is the Puerto Rico Research Hub. So we were wondering how that was founded, how it came to be, and what are its main objectives, and what is your role in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I was saying before, since 2005, we were, just me, but a group of sociologists and anthropologists were looking sort of this population movement that was happening from Puerto Rico, and it was here. So I kind of like seen the growth of the Puerto Rican population in terms of that. In like 2010, there was a group of scholars. We put together sort of special edition for the Center for Puerto Rican Studies over at Hunter College. And we kind of like, Puerto Ricans in Florida, all sort of stuff. That was 2010. And we had kind of like the discussion, like, look, this is a growing number of people here. We need to understand what was going on, all those type of things, right? But I met with a lot of resistance, right? People said like, oh, no, they're not that much, we need to be inclusive of Hispanics, white Puerto Ricans, all those type of things, right? So fast forward to 2017 when Hurricane Maria actually happens. And I think that was sort of a reintroduction of the Puerto Rican population here to the people in Central Florida, right? And then people started realizing, oh yeah, there's a lot of Puerto Ricans here. My doctor is Puerto Rican, my teacher is Puerto Rican, my neighbor is Puerto Rican. And they saw kind of like the desperation that was going on after Hurricane Maria. And even here at UCF, we saw a lot of people actually coming to the administration building asking for help. I think that if anything good came out of this was kind of like this idea that, we have a unique population here that has a very strong connection with the area. So forward to 2018, and there was kind of like a movement that perhaps another university here locally, not locally, but in the state, was gonna try to push sort of this initiative. So I rushed in, I went to the dean and said like, hey, this is the time to do this, right? And we did. We started with a website, an idea, and a mission, and it grew from there. And so now we're the center of activities dedicated to the study of Puerto Ricans, and we do 4 things. We do academic research, we provide opportunities for students to engage in research, we do outreach, so going on podcasts and telling people more about Puerto Rico, and we do partnerships because we cannot do it by ourselves. So we partner with other academic institutions and other research centers, but also nonprofit organizations, elected officials, governmental officials, chambers of commerce, businesses, all those type of things. And I think it's trying to bring that awareness together. And to this day, we were featured on the cover page in August of 2018 or so. And it was like the Sunday paper of the Orlando Sentinel. And to this day, every week I get a request from some community member or some other entity trying to know more about Puerto Rico, and we've been successful in doing so. So continuing to do, to inform the public about this, and how can we, whatever we learn from our research, we can actually impact policy. We can inform those policymakers, those people that actually are the decision makers, to make sure that they have good information. Unfortunately, like any other community, we have entertainment is always a good thing, and you have loud voices out there. But I think what we can provide is information that is based on the research and the knowledge that we have, so that can inform the public out here. We're nonpartisan. We don't take necessarily positions here and there. I think we need to talk to everybody if we really want to do change.
That's awesome. I just want to ask a question off of that. Like, what do you think is your favorite thing that this research hub has done, and like what kind of reaction have you seen from the community?
Well, when I started this, it was sort of an extension of the work that I was doing. I never thought that I was gonna hit the nerve that I did with the community, right? So, very humbling that people approached me and said, like, this is the best thing that has happened to this community. It's finally time that UCF actually realized that, we're here and we're being heard. So that sense of pride that people have about the hub, and people sort of very excited that they're participating with the university. I think that's been the most humbling experience, right? In terms of I'm not doing anything necessarily out of the realm of possibilities, but I never expected that it was going to have the profound impact that it has in the community. And I could tell you it's been at times overwhelming in terms of I get all kinds of requests from different people, but we have had sort of, I could say, like a global reach. When elections come around and they want to know what Puerto Ricans are going to vote for or not, the last election cycle, I did a program with a Swedish TV program. We're in national ABC News, Fox News.
Wow.
Interviews with newspapers in Spain, you name it. And I guess, it's sort of, the thirst of that people want to know more about the issues that are going on out here. And I think fulfilling that mission is very important out here. But yeah, never in my wildest dreams, I figured that this was gonna have that impact that it's having so far.
Yeah, that's quite the success story. I think that will definitely motivate people if they have an idea, even though you might have been shut down at the beginning, to keep working towards it, and it can still be extremely successful, and you can make change even when you would never imagine to. So that's amazing just to hear about. And it's definitely something I wanted to learn about. So that's great to know that sociologists can make that big of a change.
No, and if you think, more and more, the field is changing, the landscape in higher education is changing as well. So you have to always be one step ahead, and never be afraid to ask, because what's the worst that could happen? And no.
Right.
Yeah.
That's and you'll be surprised that a lot of people go throughout life not asking. And I think that's kind of like, from part of my research, kind of like this help-seeking behavior is always important, right? It's one of those things that early on in my research was about social support within Latino families, and it was kind of like the issue of good to have but not to use. And I think we need to change that mentality, right? Use that support that you have out there, and I think if it comes from an honest place, you're going to be successful in trying to achieve, kind of like the dreams and the initiatives that you're pushing through.
Yeah, that's how we got the podcast.
Yeah,
We asked questions, and it's we honestly don't know how we have no idea what the future holds for it, but the same motivation is what we have with this podcast. Really, we really just want to do something that reaches out to the community, and that includes different kinds of voices. And I do think that it is the future. This type of thing is the future in sociology, because of all the changes that we've been through in society. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
No, absolutely.
So you mentioned a little bit about like your work with elections and stuff like that, and just your work with the community. And I wanted to discuss a little like the main social issues that face Puerto Ricans right now. But first, to give our listeners some context, this is something that I personally would like to know more about. Could you just give like a brief discussion, if it's possible for it to be brief, about the history of Puerto Rico and its relationship to the US?
Absolutely. So 1898, the Hispanic American War, that's where in the Treaty of Parties that was signed that year, Puerto Rico became a possession of the United States. And for closely 20 years or so, it was under military rule. And eventually it gained kind of like civilian status out here. So governors were appointed by the President of the United States. So no representation from the local people whatsoever. But in 1917, we were granted citizenship. And if you go back to history, what was happening at that time, World War One. So, some scholars suggest that, there might be an inclination that we need more soldiers and people to participate out here. Puerto Ricans do not have their own army. We're part of the United States Army in itself. So kind of like tag along to World War II, right? After the end of World War II, there was sort of a lot of ideas of, what are we going to do with the world in itself, right? So in 1952, Puerto Rico became a Commonwealth of the United States. So basically, it provides a sense of autonomy. Puerto Rico has its own constitution, but in certain issues, we're still under the control of Congress and federal entities out here. So very briefly, in terms of that, Puerto Rico was a very poor nation then. It was an agricultural nation, and that was transformed into probably one of the fastest industrialization experiments that we have had. So Puerto Rico, from an agricultural place in the 1950s, became an industrial place by the 1970s. And a lot of that push was the pharmaceutical industries. So it was the section of the law in 1976 or so. It was Law 936. So this was a special tax code that essentially gave a huge tax break to any pharmaceuticals that established themselves in Puerto Rico. So that went on for 20 years or so. Actually, my hometown of Barceloneta, at one point, it was the highest concentration of pharmaceuticals in the world.
Oh, wow.
All of them, and at that time, maybe 18 of the 20 most sold drugs in the United States were manufactured in Puerto Rico. But eventually, that law it just drifted away. In 1996, it was not renewed, and it phased out in 2006. And what happened in 2006, we start seeing sort of the economic troubles of the island out here. And what happened by 2014, 2015, the government said like, hey, we have no more money, we're bankrupt. And this is where we're talking about the unequal standing of Puerto Rico with other jurisdictions, right? Other jurisdictions, like it has happened with New York City and Detroit and other places, you can go to bankruptcy court and declare bankruptcy, and there's a process to do so. Well, Puerto Rico was, for some reason, and it was sort of a legislator from South Carolina in 1984, Puerto Rico was left out of that provision. So you cannot go into bankruptcy court as other places in the United States. So at that time, we created PROMESA, which was the Financial Oversight Board that basically is handling the debt that Puerto Rico has. And that's been ongoing for a while. And now they have settled with the debtors out there. But still, the government of Puerto Rico has to pass 4 straight balanced budgets before they can retake control of their economic decisions. So for a lot of people, that looks like, feels like, smells like, Marina, you can say what is the title of your podcast?
Colonialismo.
Exactly. So that's been some of the criticism in terms of that we're sort of have certain advantages out here, but at the same time we don't, right? And that sort of gap have created. And I obviously kind of like giving you and to be completely honest, right? The party system in Puerto Rico has been responsible for the mixed spending as well, right? There's a bunch of corruption and loyalty to parties. Parties in Puerto Rico are not necessarily based on Democrat, Republican type of ideals, but more about the status of the island, right? So we have predominantly the Commonwealth Status Party, the Statehood Party, and then a small independence movement party out here. And that has been sort of the historical sort of fight in Puerto Rico in terms of how to look at the world, right? And it's like politics is the national sport, right? And to the level, that a lot of people, if you're from the Statehood Party, you don't talk to the people from the Commonwealth Party, right? And it's like very different from the categories that we have here in terms of that, but it's changing. It's changing. I think in the last election it did change, because now we have kind of like a third goes from statehood, a third is a Commonwealth, and then a third is being a coalition of different upcoming parties out here. And so the formula is changing a little bit between progressive and conservatives. So we've seen a change in that political discussion. But at the end of the day, the political party structure remains the same, and it has a very strong hold on the people of Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I had a question that is related to that. Along the same line of thought. So we've established that to some people it looks like colonialism. And so I wanted to get your perspective on that specifically. And you can feel free to share as much as you would like on that. But so yeah, based on objectively, I guess, based on your research, the research of others, how do you see Puerto Rico in terms of colonialism and all of that? And also the situation, the whole statehood debate. There's been some misconceptions about it, about what Puerto Ricans actually want. There's a lot of misconceptions in the US about it. So if you would like to speak on both of those things.
No, well, absolutely. And, you know, any conversation on Puerto Rico comes with the conversation with statehood, right? You know, one of the things, you know, for your listeners and the viewers, you know, refer to the insular cases. And those were Supreme Court decisions that back in the day clearly established that territories didn't have the same rights as states. And that's been sort of the legal argument for repealing certain things, for not including certain things. And there are groups out there, you know, it's not only Puerto Rico, but the other territories as well, right? The Virgin Islands, Guam, the Marina Islands, all those types of things, right? So, you know, there's a precedent out there in terms of looking at that. We have had, I don't know, 5, 6 referendums, and there's never been overwhelming support for any of the formulas. So that brings about, you know, sort of an excuse for a lot of the people of Congress to say, well, when the people of Puerto Rico decide, we'll make a decision, right? Now, right now, there's 2 pending legislations that might delve into this with support from some and support from others, and which is interesting because we have sort of a more, I want to say, you know, a push from the New York legislators and a push from the Florida legislators out here that are a little bit different. The Florida ones are more, hey, let's include Puerto Rico as a state, while the New York one will give sort of at least a chance for other types of self-determination out there, including independence, right? In terms of what do people want out here. It's more complicated than that, right? I would say that if the process of becoming a state is very difficult. I don't have to tell people that Congress is not necessarily united in this. It has never been a priority for Congress to include Puerto Rico as a state. And we see that. Actually, I was just reading some sort of a news article that they were asking, you know, people from Congress, like, hey, would you support statehood for Puerto Rico? And what did they say? Well, if the people of Puerto Rico support it, I will be in favor and all types of things. But that's been the same old promise of every political campaign, both Republicans and Democrats. You go down the record since the 1970s, they say the same thing when they're fundraising and campaigning and all those types of things. But it's a bit difficult in terms of what does that mean. I think Puerto Rico, you know, people tend to forget that it was 1493 when the Spaniards came in. So we've been in sort of this status for a very long time.
Yeah.
A very long time. And, you know, that really cuts into your mentality in terms of looking at that. And I think growing up, it was sort of this idea, you know, without a superpower, you're never going to be able to be yourselves or be prosperous and all sort of things. And that has fallen off the face, right? Because right now Puerto Rico is in bankruptcy, right? You know, it's you know, if you look at the percentage of people under the poverty level is very high, more than 50%. So even with the back of the United States, it hasn't worked out the way people envision out there.
Right.
So I wish, you know, my perspective is like, let's take care of things that we have that we need to resolve, both on the islands and both here before we continue that conversation. Because I'm always amazed that, you know, why is it that it's going to be you that the one that's going to change this perspective out here? So it has to change a little bit more, but at the end of the day, you know, it's a system that benefits some people.
Right.
And, you know, like they always say, follow the money. And why would you change certain things that benefit a group of people, very powerful people? Because I don't know if you know, but for your audience, as part of the Jones Act, Puerto Rico, everything that they import has to be through a U.S. vessel. And basically, our biggest port is the port of Jacksonville. So basically, if a ship comes from China, it stops in Jacksonville, drops everything out, puts it in a U.S. ship, and it goes to Puerto Rico. So what does that mean? Like I was having a conversation with my dad the other day. So we bought a new car. I'm not gonna say the brand or whatever it is. And he was asking me for the prices, right? And I said, well, you know, here they go from, you know, 23,000. I said, well, by here they say 33,000. Same car, different location, because the tariffs are so high because you have to use one of the most expensive carriers to transport merchandise. So that gets into the inflation, that gets into all the sort of things, right? That they say, well, you know, so there's a different, you know, terms of taxation and tariffs that you have to actually account for that make the cost of living a little bit higher as well. So that's kind of like some of the samples. I wish we started talking about those discussions instead of kind of like the big idea that, you know, if we resolve the status, all the problems of Puerto Rico are going to be solved like magically, right? And I think that that's the magic one that a lot of people have. But I think for the average American, they say, well, why aren't you a state? You should be a state. But it might lead to other conversations that we have had so far, right? So, you know, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, what happens to the port of Jacksonville? What happened to the workers out there? You know, what happens to certain things that we already have? And I think that's sort of the conversation that we need to start having, right? Who's going to benefit? Who's not going to benefit? And what is the cost benefit analysis out here? And whether people want it or not. And you know, ultimately, it's up to Congress. If Congress wanted Puerto Rico to become a state, they could do it tomorrow if they wanted to.
Right. And I saw, and you mentioned this a little bit a few minutes ago, but you mentioned that, so there's been a bit of a difference in like parties. There's been a rise of different parties besides the three main ones that were already there. So what does that look like, and how influential do you think that is in this conversation?
Well, they're going to be, so from what the indication, so the Statehood Party has promoted some progressive type of initiatives, you know, so, you know, issues of abortion, issues of gender identity that they're pushing in the schools, that has been met with some resistance from the most conservative part of it. So a lot of people from that wing has created this, I think it's Proyecto Dignidad, so it's Dignity Project. So they're capturing sort of the more conservative religious people that might be disillusioned a little bit from the Statehood Party. They still believe in statehood, but they want more conservative type of, you know, values out here. And then, you know, there's some dissatisfaction also from the Commonwealth Party. The Commonwealth Party is sort of catering to that conservative population as well. So some of the more progressive, they don't want to become a state. So they're shifting to another party, which is Victoria Ciudadana, which is citizenship victory, roughly translated. So you have kind of like these two new movements that are getting off the main parties out here. And that is basically based on kind of like this progressive piece and versus conservative type of ideals out here. So now you have kind of like this separation of all those type of things. So it's going to be interesting to see in the future what would be if the rhetoric is going to change a little bit more, that it's going to be more, conservative versus progressive type of politics involved out here. But for the foreseeable future, I think still the status question remains of that point of departure for the three parties out there.
Right. And so between the different political parties, what are their arguments for statehood and what are the arguments against statehood?
Well, lately the statehood people are saying like, this is a civil rights issue. You should treat us equally. And, we are just getting the short end of the stick. We fight the wars. We do all these good things and you're not giving us that opportunity. The Commonwealth people are saying like, hey, look, we're different. We have a different language. We have our own constitution, our own way of life, which ironically enough, in the United States, there's no official language. In Puerto Rico, the official languages are English and Spanish, both of them. So I said like, no, I mean, we can still work within this. It has, it's work. We need to revise it, all those type of things. I think, and the independence movement is saying like, hey, no, we need to be our own independent nation out here. So statehood might not be the solution. I see more and more it has evolved that people are saying like, maybe Commonwealth was a transitory type of solution to this. So there's been talk about being sort of an affiliated Republic of the United States. So that language has been put out there. Do we need to revise all those type of relationships that we might have? Sort of some of the things that, in terms of, do we allow people to vote for the president of the United States? But obviously, if you open that to Puerto Rico, then you have to open it to the territories, right? And so the working assumption for the congressional delegations is that Puerto Ricans are going to be overwhelmingly Democrat. So that's why they don't want to open that door out there. But there's been pushes to that, right? And kind of like seeing this, rise of more conservative, more less progressive type of policies, that's open to interpretation as well. But that's been the running assumption, right? But I think a lot of, at least the congressional delegation here in Florida sort of understands that. So, in those congressional bills for resolving the status of Puerto Rico, there's more Republican support for the one that Congressman Soto has than the one that is coming out from New York.
I guess I just had, before we move on to the next question, I just had one small question. So you mentioned the referendum, and I think that there's a lot of talk about that in the US whenever we talk about Puerto Rico, but I don't think a lot of people know what that actually means or what that actually looks like for Puerto Ricans. So I actually don't know personally. So I'm wondering, so to what extent, since we know that Puerto Ricans don't have representation in Congress here, there's legislators that apparently are pushing different options from Florida and New York. So in the referendum, like, how involved are the people of Puerto Rico on the islands? Like, what does that process actually look like?
Yeah, so the referendums are non-binding, right? This is not that they're not attached to any legislation from Congress, right? So they're more like polls.
Okay.
And they have come up with different type of caveats, right? Like the last one was statehood, yes or no. So a lot of people that said, well, I'm not going to vote. And so it was a small margin of victory. A lot of people didn't participate. Obviously the statehood people are going to say like, hey, everybody had a chance to say what they wanted to. And, majority is 50+1, right? And the majority in this survey, the majority of people voted for this, right? In all instances, it has been the same. So it has never been a clear process that says like, hey, not like the Brexit type of vote, right? That said like, hey, if you vote for this, it's going to attach to this legislation, and this is what's going to happen, right? There's never been that type of push. I think that's what some of this legislation that they're trying to push out here might capture, right? That there might be some binding, there might be some type of responsibility in the part of Congress to really accept those results. But we have never, that I know of, had that opportunity. So, we continue kind of like that battle, and it depends, does the referendum comes from when the statehood party's in charge or when the Commonwealth party's in charge. So it's always, it turns very political. It's not as fluid as it's sort of, we tend to believe here, kind of like in the press coverage and all the stuff. I think it's a little bit more complicated.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for explaining all that. There's a lot to go over. But so I want to ask what kind of issues you specifically study and how you think the relationship between the US and Puerto Rico affects those issues.
Well, one of the things that we're doing, and we have a grant from the National Academy of Sciences, we're looking at climate migration. And basically, we're studying how receiving communities, and specifically here, Orange and Osceola County, responded to the migration of Puerto Ricans after Hurricane Maria. So basically, what can we do, right? And a lot of the things is one of the things of, we're seeing out here the displacements of people is happening every day. And as climate change continues to happen, this is something that all communities must confront out here. So we're helping from the study, and we're kind of like doing the final results out here and sort of analyzing the data. How can we, prepare cities to be ready for this? Not only in the context of Puerto Ricans, but for other groups as well. I think one of the things that we want to push also, we know that Puerto Rico has some issues right now in terms of, not only the damage after Hurricane Maria, the slow process of recovery, but also, the financial crisis that has crippled the island for a long time. So we want to make sure that, we collaborate with the nonprofits, with the people of Puerto Rico to make sure that, we're sort of a vessel to get that story out. So we're working, in some collaborations with University of Puerto Rico and see how can we collaborate and do some of the research out there. We looked at sort of the health issues as well. So, what happened to the healthcare capacity in Puerto Rico as well. When you look at sort of the health determinants for Puerto Ricans, usually, the health profile of Puerto Ricans usually is the worst of all Latino groups. So try to understand what are some of the issues that are going on out there. And, hopefully we can also provide, we provided sort of that home for a lot of the students that had to be displaced after Hurricane Maria. And some of that works that we did, a chapter that we published were actually students that were displaced after Hurricane Maria, that they were actually work, and now they have a publication that came out and talking about a topic that really affected their everyday life.
Okay, so I guess, and this is, maybe it's a follow-up question, but so in what way then do you see, going back, I guess, to Hallie's question, so in what way do you see the relationship between the US and Puerto Rico directly impacting the effects of these disasters that have already happened? So how does the actual political / historical context has affected those the situation of Puerto Rico right now after those disasters?
Yeah, no, and especially here in the case of Florida, right? We have had a continuous growth of the Puerto Rican population. We're almost at 1.2 million Puerto Ricans, more than New York, more than New Jersey, more than Pennsylvania out here. And I think that it's the connection between the two. I think if we don't resolve issues on the island, people are going to continue to come here. And if people continue to come here, what are you going to do with that population? Right? And if you look at the numbers, the Puerto Rican population is a young population, much younger than the average person in Florida. So now it's sort of, what do we do to make sure that we take on that talent, we foster that talent, and make sure that we continue emphasizing on the growth of that community. It's not only going to benefit the Puerto Rican community, it's going to benefit everybody. But I think there's a connection between the two. And sometimes we tend not to follow some of the things that are happening. And that's one of the recommendations that we say, like, local governments need to understand what are the populations out there. Because people are not going to go to strange places after a disaster. They're going to go to those places that they already have a significant number of people. So that basically we can start learning what can we do. And remember, with even climate migration, some of them is going to be temporarily, some are going to be short term, some are going to be long term. And we need to have better tools to sort of track that type of movement. And what do we do? Do we have the capacity or not? Because eventually for Florida, it could mean the same. We can be hit by a hurricane, and probably we're going to go to the places that we have family nearby or other places out there. So I think that there's a lot of lessons that we want to take. But I think sort of our elected officials and decision makers do understand that there's a very strong connection between Puerto Rico and Florida, and we need to account for that. And they know that in New York as well, Pennsylvania, the East Coast, but all the way. I get requests from like different groups in our Instagram pages. So there's a lot of Puerto Ricans in California, Texas, Arizona, all those places out here. So I think it's important that we start understanding those dynamics out here, because the two are intertwined. I mean, I think that they're connected, and the more we understand that, the better we can come up with effective solutions for it.
Right.
Yes, and this must also affect the population and the society as a whole in Puerto Rico. So do you know could you speak a bit more about the effects according to some of your research that you've seen maybe on the island as well of this whole migration?
Yeah, no. So if you look at the difference between the 2010 and the 2020 census, there was almost a 400,000 people decline in Puerto Rico. And that's a significant amount of people to be lost in a decade. And now the population profile in Puerto Rico is elderly. Basically, we have about 22% of the population in Puerto Rico that is 65 and older. So think about the consequences of that in terms of not only population replacement, but who's going to take care of people that are retired. They can now participate in the labor force anymore. We have the financial crisis, so they depend on the pensions that those hedge funds were put at risk out there. So there's very serious consequences out here. And I think at least from the with the pandemic, with everything that happened, the rate of the out migration for Puerto Rico kind of stopped, not entirely, but it significantly decreased out here, which is a good thing. And with all the money that's been allocated for the recovery of the island, that brings about some hopefulness that we can create a better infrastructure, not only the roads, but there's still issues with electricity, there's still issues with utilities out there that I think are very important out here. But there's some very serious issues out here that are a result of those of the combinations of not having necessarily the strong representation in Congress that we need to, and sort of advocates to make sure that the projects get done, and again having this sequence of events, so financial crisis, hurricane, earthquake, pandemic, in a span of 5 years, right? And that tells you about the resiliency of the Puerto Rican people and having to deal with that. And and talking about other issues that are happening on the island as well. So those are issues that are affecting out there, and that eventually, if we don't take care of those, people are going to be forced, almost forced to seek a new future somewhere else, and more than likely it's going to be here in Florida.
You said the term hedge fund, and I was wondering what you meant by that and how that is related to what's going on there.
Well, like a lot of governments in local governments in the United States that they put their pension funds on different hedge funds out there. They put it out there on the market. The market, for in the case of Puerto Rico, when they declared bankruptcy, their credit went out the door, and all those bonds and funds were classified as junk. So when people wanted to retire, there was no money, and there was a decrease in terms of that. So again, why the system hasn't changed is because there are a lot of people that benefits from this arrangement. I don't think it's the people of Puerto Rico, but there's some individuals out there that do benefit from this arrangement. And that tells you about, the inequalities that we have. And it's not only Puerto Rico, it's throughout the world as well.
Absolutely.
Right. And so related to that, I saw that you posted, or I guess published, an article on with Dr. Elizabeth Aranda titled "When the U.S. Sneezes, Puerto Rico Already Has a Cold," and this is back in 2017 with Hurricane Maria and all the things that happened on the island. And so you spoke a little bit. You've already mentioned the health disparities between Puerto Ricans and the rest, all other Latinx groups in the U.S. Also, the disparities of among Puerto Ricans on the island. And so in that article, you mentioned a few responses that at the time could help the situation of Puerto Rico. And so there are four main ones, which was waiving the Jones Act, massive relief and reconstruction aid by Congress, debt forgiveness to invest in reconstruction rather than Wall Street hedge fund managers, and finally giving Puerto Ricans the right to vote for the President of the United States. So we were wondering, do you still hold the same views? Do you have new solutions or new actions that can be taken by the government of the United States to help Puerto Ricans on the island?
Yeah, no, I mean, I still, some of those have come to fruition very slowly, but they have, right? And we're still gonna see how that process of recovery and reconstruction is gonna happen. But there's been some funds allocated and all those type of things. But notice that we didn't say we need to resolve the status of Puerto Rico. We didn't go there, right? I think these are probably very practical solutions out here. I don't know about the voting for the President of the United States, if that's going to happen or not. But I remember that when we wrote that article, it came from a very raw place, right? Because it was very personal. Because it was kind of like the sense of desperation that us of here in the diaspora were feeling, that we couldn't do anything. And we're seeing kind of like those images and everything that's going on. You couldn't communicate with your family members. You were thinking the worst. So it did came from a very emotional, raw type of place. But I think very accurate. I mean, we try to keep those emotions in check to make sure that we follow some of what we have found in our research and some very plausible solutions to what was happening. But yeah, I mean, if we start working, I think it's pushing that discussion, right? That let's work on certain things a bit at a time. Kind of like have those small victories, not kind of like a winner take all approach, because it hasn't worked. I mean, just to be frank, it hasn't worked. That approach hasn't worked for 100 or so years with the U.S. It didn't work for 400 years with Spain. So we need to start doing new approaches, different approaches out there.
Right. So then with COVID specifically, on top of all of those things, other issues that were going on. So do you, are there any new initiatives that you think should take place at this point to deal with that new situation?
Yeah, no, and COVID has been interesting, right? Because from a long time, if you look at sort of the incidence of cases in Puerto Rico is lower than the continental United States. Vaccination records are much better than other places. It hasn't turned into the political discussion out here that if you're from one side, you need to do this, and if you're from the other side, you need not to do certain things. So that shows you, a resolve on the part of the Puerto Rican people and the decision makers, but it also showed you that Puerto Rico had no alternative whatsoever. I think it wasn't, if you want, and that shows you kind of like the privilege and the power and in decision making, right? I don't think Puerto Rico could afford to hope that the disease will go away, because they don't have the infrastructure to really take on a pandemic if it's full blown like other places. So in that sense, Puerto Rico did well, but in a sense, it didn't have any other choice. So they had to make those decisions. Still to this day, I just traveled during Christmas, and you have to show your vaccine card, and you need to have your mask and all sort of stuff, and had a great time. But they've taken it most seriously, and I think it was because they know what happens when you don't take things very seriously, and the consequences are very real. And when you don't have a lot of resources, sometimes you need to make those tough choices.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting perspective. I've never even thought about it that way. So it's really interesting to see that like they made the decision because they had to, not really because they had that much of a choice. So that's very interesting.
No, absolutely. And some, unfortunately, other places have taken on this freedom type of view, and because people can, the hospitals are going to be there. If something bad happens, they're going to have coverage and all those type of things. They have more resources, right? And I think that sometimes people don't consider the privileges that they have when they make these decisions.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that in the last episode, just about how there have been, even within the US, obviously the situation between the US and Puerto Rico are completely different, but even among marginalized groups in the US, it's totally different. The situation is different. They have been, people of color and people in poverty have ended up having less access to vaccines or less access to healthcare. They don't have coverage a lot of the time. So it's interesting how those disparities also, we can see them here, even though it's not as much or talked about as much. And I guess this one's a question that it's okay if you don't have an answer. But do you know anything about COVID among Puerto Ricans here in the US? Have there been any differences or disparities in that case?
Anecdotally, right? Because if you look at the databases that the CDC has, and if you're taking the vaccine, they don't ask you for your subgroup identity, right? Ethnicity, or anything like that. So it's kind of hard to ascertain. But working with some community groups, and also so there was some hesitation, like other communities, a lot of myth dispel out there. But one of the things, I've been on TV programs to actually, telling people that, if you want to do it, it's safe to do it. And, and there's been some, just like everybody else, there's been some controversial point of views on the vaccine and all those type of things. But I think there was a hesitation at the beginning. But that's being sort of resolved, not resolved per se, but it's getting a little bit better in terms of that. But it's kind of hard to tell scientifically what's going on, and that's kind of like the push of what we need more and better data to tease these things out. Don't make it overly complicated for people to find out how they're doing it in the community, right? So that's been kind of like my push from the beginning of my career. Yes, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx is great, but we need to come down by ethnic group because experiences are very different.
Yeah. So we just mentioned our last episode, and in that episode we talked about intellectual activism and just the importance of like educating people beyond the institution. And so I was wondering what you have done and what your research does, especially within like the Puerto Rico hub, how that really goes beyond the walls of academia and how you guys help empower and educate other people beyond these walls.
Yeah, I think sometimes we need to check our privileges as faculty members as well, right? You know, and it takes, you know, with years and experience and all those type of things, right? And I think we're changing. So what is the impact of your work, right? Is it just citation count? Is it publishing in X or Y journal? Or how can you package what you learn and try to bring that knowledge to the community as well? You know, I think that there's a strength in learning from the community as well. And sometimes we forget, you know, being affiliated with the university, having a title does bring about a lot of respect within the community. And people, I mean, I'm the humblest guy you can ever meet. But, you know, people need that. We need to work with the community and, you know, but not necessarily what I think is right, but what my research is telling me that I could put out there so we can make better decisions, right? And this is sort of the scientific proposition out there that sometimes we forget that, you know, we have a lot of information to give out there and that we assume that people know it. And it's not the case, right? And I think more and more, I think for academics, you know, don't wait for the reporter to come to you. You know, if you see something, you know, write an op-ed, you know, try to go to other venues as well and inform people of what's happening. What is your research telling you? You know, not necessarily talking in the echo chambers, right? You know, going on a conference to say, you know, which is, it's fine, you know, kind of like that exercise, but we need to go beyond out here because more than ever we need it to make sure that our work is valued, but that we also bring about the importance of our work.
Yeah, thank you. We didn't tell him to say that. That was just because that's basically exactly what we said last episode, almost precisely. So that's wonderful. I'm glad that you're. It seems like you put a lot of work into your community and you want to see the best out of it. And it's just wonderful to see an academic and a professor go beyond the walls of the institution and do a lot more. So thank you for all the work that you do.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so I guess one last question on that topic. So how would you describe then, like, the response that your work has received from, well, specifically from academics? Like, yeah, what has the response been since you're a lot more into the community?
No, I mean, even from academics and, you know, kind of like the recognition, you know, so a lot of presentations, a lot of research ties, a lot of collaboration, you know, and I'm glad that people are taking Puerto Rico a little bit more seriously, that they're including their research, you know, and at all levels, right? From, you know, an undergrad thesis to a master thesis to a PhD, to a conference presentation, to a book, to all this type of things, right? I think it's important at all levels, and having that recognition is important as well. So it has gone beyond my wildest imagination, the amount of support that we have had. And, you know, I want people to make sure that it's not only about me, but that I'm able to empower the next generation so this thing is sustainable and that we continue to build upon this, and that they use kind of like this example as a blueprint of what we can do for other communities of interest that we need to have, especially here in a place like Central Florida, where we continue to have a massive growth for our Hispanic population. You know, we need to have a Venezuelan research hub, we need to have a Colombian research hub, we need to have, you know, different research hubs that are interested in the specific of their own communities, that, you know, we can take those lessons and learn from each other.
Yeah, I lied. This wasn't the last question on that. Hallie, I know Hallie had a question about, and I'll have her ask, about getting involved in his work.
Yeah, so anybody that want, you know, just send me an email or check us out, just Puerto Rico Research Hub, and you can Google and all those type of things. We have different opportunities from, 0 credit hours to volunteer to different events. And when we have grant funding is also an opportunity to do so. And you don't have to be a social major whatsoever. You don't have to be Puerto Rican. You just need to have a slight interest in Puerto Rico, and we look at different issues out there that touch upon the island, and the experience of Puerto Ricans here in the United States as well. So I'm a fan of diversity, and I think the more we know about other people, the better we are, and we need to continue to push that mentality. And I'm a fan of learning, right? I don't have bad experience. I have learning experiences, right? And you can build from those. And it's what you do from those experiences that builds your knowledge. And learning is not a static process, it's a continuous process. And once you get into that mentality, that it's not about grades, it's not about journal articles, it's not about promotions, it's about learning, right? And what can you learn to have a better world, to make yourself a better person out there? As long as you do that, you'll be all right.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I'll let Hallie ask the last question, which was mine, but you can take it.
Yeah, I mean, you just said a lot about what you guys work on, but is there anything else you'd like to plug? Any events that are happening recently, or like any just other social media pages you'd like us to, or our listeners to check out?
Yeah, so we have Instagram and Facebook pages, so make sure to follow us. And knowing the media is always important. If there's one action that you can do, you want to do social change, click like or share, because every news coverage, the editor is going to decide whether to put that news thing again if it has a wide audience out there. So make sure to do that. That's probably the simple thing that you could do, obviously from reliable sources and all those type of things. But yeah, we have an upcoming event, and this is a fun event. We're teaming up with Major League Baseball, and we're doing the Puerto Rico Baseball Day here with UCF Baseball on March 26th. We're going to have Major League is bringing their Playbook Clinic, which is an introductory clinic for kids ages 5 to 12. Doesn't matter what level of baseball expertise you have, it's open to the public. And then head to the game against Sanford, and as the Knights take on them. And we're going to have teachers, Puerto Rican type of festivities, so make sure to check it out. And it's sort of a recognition of the great contributions of baseball players out here. And we're going to have a special guest as well. So it's posted on our social media pages, so make sure to check it out. And you can cut this also if you want to, if it's going to date your podcast, but that's fine. But yeah, so we continue to have those events and, doing other things as well. So that's the best way to keep informed of what we're doing. And if you're going to participate and, just share it, even if, continue to spread that message out there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, everyone, please check that out. Go like, go follow, share.
Yeah, we'll leave links.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Links to all this will be in the bio for this episode, easy access.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate all the insight that you've given us, everything that you've taught us, and just all the knowledge that you have from your experience. So thank you for that.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations to you for putting this together. So look forward to listening more. And for the listeners, keep following them.
Please. I do have some people from Puerto Rico, family and friends that are watching, so I hope they'll appreciate this video, feel represented.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I guess before we go, we want to reintroduce our last episode, which connects a little bit with your work. So it was on intellectual activism. So we want to refer people back to that video if you haven't seen it or listened to it. So yes, that one was on intellectual activism and how activists and educators can come together and move beyond the walls of academia to create social change. And our next episode, our upcoming episode after this one, will be with Dr. Cox from the sociology department. and that will focus on the main sociological theories and some marginalized perspectives like critical race theory, which we also mentioned in the last episode. So we just want to introduce that for anybody listening, and I guess we'll see you next time.
See you then. We'd also like to thank the University of Central Florida Department of Sociology for their generous support of this podcast.